Behind the gates of Beverly Hills, a family's perfect image hid dark secrets: a controlling father, a broken mother, and two sons pushed to their limit. This is the gripping account of the Menendez brothers, the tension that consumed their home and the night their world fell apart. Listen closely as we uncover the events that led to one of the most shocking crimes in history. The Menendez house on Elm Drive was the kind of place that made you stop and stare. Sitting behind tall wrought iron gates, the sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion had a way of commanding attention. Its white stucco walls gleamed under the California sun, and the neatly trimmed hedges out front seemed to whisper that the people inside had life figured out. It was the kind of house that screamed success, a place where dreams didn't just come true, they stayed true. Jose Menendez was the man who made it all happen. To those who knew him, he was the embodiment of the American dream. Born in Cuba, Jose had arrived in the United States with nothing but ambition in his pocket. He worked his way up from humble beginnings, climbing through the cutthroat world of entertainment. By the late 1980s, he was a powerful executive with ties to Hollywood and an iron grip on his family's future. Jose wasn't just successful, he was driven, relentless, a man who believed that anything less than perfection was a waste of time. Kitty Menendez had once been the bright, charming counterpart to Jose's intensity. A former beauty queen, she had an easy smile and a warmth that drew people in. But years of living under Jose's demanding expectations had dimmed that light. Friends said she seemed fragile now, like glass that might shatter under too much pressure. Kitty filled her days managing the household, organising charity events and maintaining the family's social image. To outsiders, she was the perfect wife and mother. But to those who saw her up close, she was a woman fighting battles that no one could quite name. Then there were the sons, Lyle and Eric. Handsome, athletic, and polite in public, they seemed to have inherited their parents' best qualities. Lyle, the older of the two, carried himself with the kind of confidence you might expect from a young man who had grown up surrounded by wealth and opportunity. He wore expensive suits like they were second skin and spoke with the assertiveness of someone who had been told his whole life he was destined for greatness. But behind the swagger was a boy still looking for his father's approval. Eric, 3 years younger, was the quieter one. While Lyle had no problem stealing the spotlight, Eric was more comfortable in the background. He had a shy smile that made him seem approachable, and a talent for tennis that had people whispering about professional potential. But beneath his soft-spoken demeanour was a young man who seemed to carry a weight too heavy for his years. Where Lyle deflected Jose's criticism with defiance, Eric absorbed it like a sponge, every harsh word sinking deep into his skin. For all their wealth and privilege, the Menendez family rarely seemed at ease. Jose ruled the household with the same precision he brought to boardroom meetings, and his standards were as high at home as they were in business. He demanded obedience, excellence, and discipline, and he had little patience for anything less. Lyle and Eric learned early that failure wasn't an option. If they didn't measure up, Jose's disappointment would cut sharper than any punishment. Kitty, caught in the middle, tried to smooth things over, but her efforts often felt like trying to put out a wildfire with a glass of water. The family's dinners were particularly tense affairs. The dining room was a showpiece of luxury, with a crystal chandelier hanging over a polished mahogany table that could seat 12, even though there were only 4 of them. The food was always impeccable. Steaks cooked to perfection, salads with ingredients that could have been plucked from a magazine spread, but the conversation was less polished. Jose dominated the table, his voice commanding as he laid out his expectations for the week. Kitty sat quietly, nodding in agreement, her eyes darting to the boys as if to warn them to stay in line. Lyle would push back now and then, his tone clipped and sarcastic. Eric, on the other hand, rarely said a word. He kept his head down, his fork moving across his plate like he was trying to disappear into his chair. It wasn't just at the dinner table that the cracks in the family's facade started to show. The pressure Jose put on his sons bled into every corner of their lives. For Lyle, it was his grades and his future in business. Jose wanted him to follow in his footsteps, to be a leader, a powerhouse. For Eric, it was tennis. Jose saw Eric's talent as a golden ticket, something to be perfected and exploited. Eric's coach said he was good enough to go professional, but Jose didn't care about potential. He wanted results. Anything less than a win wasn't worth celebrating. Kitty's role in the family was harder to define. She wasn't as outwardly demanding as Jose, but her silence could be just as heavy. Sometimes she'd hover in the kitchen while the boys studied, her hands wringing a dish towel as if trying to summon the courage to say something. Other times she'd retreat into herself, disappearing into her bedroom with a glass of wine and a book she'd never finish. The truth was, the Menendez family wasn't a picture of happiness. It was a house held together by appearances and expectations, where love felt conditional and approval was always just out of reach. From the outside, they were perfect. But inside, behind the gates and the polished facade, they were a family teetering on the edge of something none of them could quite name. Life in the Menendez house wasn't built for grey areas. Things were either perfect or they were a problem. Jose Menendez lived by that rule, and everyone around him learned to do the same, or at least pretend to. For Jose, perfection wasn't just a goal, it was a way of life. He made sure his sons understood that from the moment they could walk. Lyle still remembered the time he brought home a B in middle school science. Jose had stared at the report card in silence for a full minute before he spoke. "You think this is acceptable?" he finally said, his voice calm but cold. Lyle had tried to explain that it was one test, that he'd make up for it on the next one. But Jose didn't want excuses. He wanted results. That night, Lyle spent hours at the kitchen table redoing the assignment while Jose sat across from him, silently watching. For Eric, the lessons were different but no less exacting. Tennis wasn't just a hobby, it was a future. Jose made sure of that. When Eric won, Jose would slap him on the back and tell him he was proud. But if he lost, the car ride home from the courts was unbearable. Jose didn't yell, he didn't have to. His disappointment hung in the air like smoke, choking Eric until he could barely breathe. "You have talent," Jose would say, his voice sharp. But talent means nothing without discipline. Kitty tried to soften the edges where she could, but even she seemed to crumble under the weight of Jose's expectations. There were days when she'd sit on the edge of the boys' beds and stroke their hair, whispering that things would be better when they were older. "He just wants what's best for you," she'd say, as if trying to convince herself as much as them. But her presence was fleeting. Her attempts at reassurance often drowned out by the harsher reality of their home life. The family's wealth didn't help much either. To the outside world, money was supposed to fix everything, to make life easier, smoother. But in the Menendez house, it felt like another weapon in Jose's arsenal. He used it to control, to manipulate, to keep everyone in line. When Lyle wanted to go to Princeton, Jose made it clear the tuition wasn't a gift, it was an investment. "Don't waste it," he said. "You're lucky to have this opportunity. Most kids your age don't." Lyle nodded, but deep down he resented how every part of his life felt like a transaction. For Eric, the stakes were even higher. Tennis wasn't just expensive, it was consuming. Coaches, equipment, travel, it all came at a cost, and Jose made sure Eric knew it. "We're putting everything into you," Jose told him after one particularly grueling match. "Don't make me regret it." Eric nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat, but the pressure weighed on him like a stone. He started having nightmares about losing matches, about Jose standing over him, shaking his head in disappointment. Kitty's struggles were harder to pinpoint but no less visible. She'd started drinking more over the years, a glass of wine with dinner turning into 2 or 3 before bedtime. Some mornings, she barely made it out of her room, her eyes rimmed with red as she shuffled through the kitchen in her robe. The boys tried not to notice, but it was hard to ignore. Lyle, always the more assertive one, once asked her if she was okay. "I'm fine," she said quickly, brushing him off. "Just tired." But the look in her eyes told a different story. There were moments when it seemed like the family might break free from the cycle. Kitty would smile at Jose across the dinner table, and for a second, things would feel normal. Lyle and Eric would crack jokes during family movie nights, and the sound of their laughter would fill the house. But those moments were fleeting, always giving way to the underlying tension that never really went away. The turning point came during the summer of 1989. Eric had just finished a particularly difficult tournament, one where he'd made it to the finals but lost in a close match. Jose was furious. "You had it," he said on the car ride home, his voice sharp and cutting, and you let it slip through your fingers. Eric stared out the window, his throat tight. He wanted to explain how hard he'd tried, how much it hurt to lose, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Jose didn't care about effort, only results. That night, Eric confided in Lyle. They sat on the floor of Eric's room, the glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. Eric's voice was shaky as he told Lyle about the things he could never say out loud to anyone else. The fear, the pressure, the weight of trying to be perfect. Lyle listened, his jaw tightening with every word. "It's not just you," he finally said, his voice low. "I feel it too. We're both trapped." The brothers' bond grew stronger after that, their shared experiences forging a connection that no one else could understand. But with that bond came a dangerous thought. What if they could break free? What if they didn't have to live like this anymore? It started as a whisper, a fleeting idea that neither of them dared to say out loud. But as the summer wore on, the whisper grew louder until it became a roar they couldn't ignore. By the time August rolled around, the Menendez house was a powder keg, ready to explode. By August of 1989, the Menendez mansion had become a house of unspoken words and lingering tension. Each day felt like walking on a tightrope, every conversation a potential trigger. Jose's expectations, Kitty's growing detachment, and the brothers' simmering frustrations collided like tectonic plates, creating invisible cracks that threatened to erupt at any moment. For Lyle, the resentment had been building for years. He had always felt like a pawn in Jose's grand design, a piece on a chessboard moved with precision but little care for his individuality. Princeton had been Jose's idea, not his. The future Jose mapped out, business school, corporate success, and one day taking over his empire, felt more like a prison sentence than a privilege. Every time Lyle tried to assert himself, Jose would find a way to remind him who held the power. One evening, during a tense family dinner, Lyle mentioned wanting to start his own business someday, something independent of his father's influence. Jose didn't look up from his plate. "You think you can do better than what I've built?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with steel. Lyle opened his mouth to respond, but Kitty cut in, her tone pleading. "It's not about better, Jose. He doesn't know what he wants," Jose snapped, silencing her. Lyle's jaw tightened, his grip on his fork so firm it left indentations in his palm. For Eric, the breaking point came in quieter moments. His life revolved around tennis, but the joy it once brought him had long since been replaced by anxiety and fear of failure. After a particularly grueling practice, Eric confided in his coach about the pressure he was under. "My dad expects me to win every match," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't make a single mistake." The coach, a kind but pragmatic man, pat Eric on the shoulder. "Every great player feels pressure, kid. Use it to make you stronger." But Eric didn't feel stronger. He felt like he was drowning. That summer, Eric began to withdraw even more. He spent hours in his room, staring at the ceiling, the walls, anything but the world outside. He started having nightmares, dark, suffocating dreams where he was trapped in a maze with no way out. Lyle noticed the change and tried to pull Eric out of his spiral, but he was struggling too. They were both caught in the same web, and neither could find the strength to break free. Meanwhile, Kitty's presence in the house grew increasingly ghost-like. She spent more time in her bedroom, the door closed, the sound of the television muffled behind it. Some days she didn't come downstairs at all. When she did, her movements were slow, her expression vacant. The glass of wine in her hand became a near-constant companion. Lyle once overheard her on the phone with a friend, her voice thick with tears. "I don't know what's wrong with me," she said. I don't feel like myself anymore." The tension in the house was suffocating, but no one dared to address it directly. They all moved through the days like actors in a play, following the script without ever acknowledging the cracks in the set. But the cracks were there, growing wider with each passing moment. The final straw came one evening in mid-August. Jose called the brothers into his office, a space that exuded power with its dark wood furniture and towering bookshelves. He sat behind his desk, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression unreadable. Lyle and Eric stood across from him, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. "I've made a decision," Jose said, his tone measured. "You boys have had enough freedom. It's time for you to start living up to your potential." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Lyle, you'll stay at Princeton, but I expect better grades and more focus. No more wasting time on things that don't matter." He turned to Eric, his gaze sharp. "And you, your tennis career is your only priority now. No distractions, no excuses." Lyle's fists clenched at his sides. "And what if we don't want to follow your plan?" he asked, his voice low but defiant. Jose leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "Then you can leave this house," he said simply. "But don't expect to come back." Eric's stomach twisted. He glanced at Lyle, hoping for some reassurance, but his brother's face was set in stone. "You can't just—" Eric started, but Jose cut him off. "I can, and I will," he said firmly. "This isn't a democracy, it's my house, my rules." The brothers left the office in silence, their footsteps echoing down the hallway. That night they sat together in Lyle's room, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Eric broke the silence. "We can't live like this anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyle didn't respond right away. He stared out the window, his mind racing. When he finally spoke, his words were measured but resolute. "We won't." For the first time, they allowed themselves to entertain the thought that had been lurking in the shadows for weeks. It started as a whisper, a fleeting idea that neither of them dared to fully acknowledge. But as the days wore on, the whisper grew louder until it became impossible to ignore. By August 20th, the Menendez house was a ticking time bomb, and the brothers knew it was only a matter of time before it exploded. August 20th, 1989 began like any other Sunday in Beverly Hills. The late summer sun cast long shadows over the manicured lawns, the air thick with the lazy warmth of a weekend winding down. For the Menendez family, the day carried no outward signs of what was to come. Jose had spent most of the afternoon on the phone in his office. Kitty had taken a nap after lunch, and the brothers had gone out, saying they were meeting friends. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the house had settled into its usual routine. Kitty sat in the family room, a glass of red wine in hand, flipping through a magazine she barely registered. Across from her, Jose was glued to the television, watching a documentary about organised crime. The low hum of the TV filled the room, the flickering images casting faint shadows on the cream-coloured walls. The brothers returned just after dark. The metallic clink of the front gate closing behind them echoed faintly through the still air. They parked in the driveway, the car's engine cutting out with a soft rumble. Inside, Lyle killed the headlights, and for a moment they sat in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on them. "You ready?" Lyle asked, his voice steady but low. Eric hesitated, his fingers gripping the edges of his seat. His chest felt tight, each breath shallow. He didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the darkened windows of the house. Finally he nodded. "Yeah," he whispered. Lyle reached into the back seat, retrieving the 2 shotguns they had purchased earlier that week. The weapons felt heavy in his hands, their cold steel biting into his palms. Eric took his reluctantly, his fingers trembling as they wrapped around the barrel. Neither of them spoke as they stepped out of the car and made their way toward the house. The mansion was quiet when they entered. The faint sound of the television drifted down the hallway, mingling with the soft hum of the air conditioning. The brothers moved carefully, their footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. Eric glanced toward the staircase, a fleeting thought urging him to turn around, to run, to leave and never look back. But Lyle's resolve pulled him forward, his older brother's presence a tether he couldn't break. They paused outside the family room, the doorway framing a scene of mundane tranquility. Kitty had shifted on the couch, her head resting against the cushions, the magazine now abandoned on the coffee table. Jose sat upright, his arms crossed, his eyes locked on the screen. For a moment, the brothers simply stood there, their breath shallow, their hearts pounding in unison. It was Lyle who stepped forward first. He raised the shotgun, his movements deliberate but not hesitant. The barrel trembled slightly as he took aim, his eyes narrowing. Eric followed suit, his hands shaking as he struggled to steady his grip. The first shot shattered the silence, the thunderous crack reverberating through the room. Kitty jerked upright, a sharp gasp escaping her lips as her glass toppled to the floor. Jose's head snapped back, his body slumping forward in an unnatural arc. Before either of them could react further, a second shot rang out, followed by a third. The room erupted into chaos, the once quiet mansion now filled with the deafening echoes of violence. Kitty scrambled to her feet, her screams piercing the air. She stumbled toward the hallway, her hands outstretched as if trying to find an escape. "No!" she cried, her voice raw with terror. Eric froze, his shotgun slipping slightly in his grasp. Lyle moved quickly, stepping forward and firing again. Kitty's body crumpled to the ground, her cries cut short as the force of the blast sent her sprawling. The brothers stood there for a moment, their ears ringing, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling their nostrils. Eric's chest heaved, his breaths coming in ragged gasps as he stared at the scene before him. The pristine family room was now a scene of destruction. Blood spattered the walls, furniture overturned, the soft glow of the television flickering eerily in the background. "Is it over?" Eric whispered, his voice barely audible. Lyle didn't answer right away. He stepped forward, surveying the room with cold precision. Jose's body lay slumped over the armrest of the couch, his shirt soaked in crimson. Kitty's lifeless form was crumpled near the doorway, her wide eyes staring at nothing. Lyle lowered his weapon, the tension in his shoulders slowly easing. "Yeah!" he said finally, his voice flat. "It's done." The two brothers stood in the aftermath of their actions, the weight of what they had done pressing down on them like a tidal wave. Eric dropped to his knees, the shotgun slipping from his hands and clattering to the floor. His head fell into his hands, muffling the sound of his sobs. Lyle didn't move. He stood rigid, his gaze fixed on the television, where the documentary continued to play, as if nothing had happened. Minutes passed before either of them spoke again. Lyle finally turned to Eric, his voice steady but hollow. "We need to call the cops." Eric looked up, his tear-streaked face pale and stricken. "What do we tell them?" Lyle's jaw tightened. He didn't have an answer. All he knew was that there was no going back. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The Menendez mansion was silent again. The echoes of the gunshots had faded, leaving a heavy stillness in their place. The once pristine family room, with its gleaming surfaces and carefully curated decor, now bore the unmistakable marks of chaos. Blood spattered the cream-coloured walls, the glass from Kitty's shattered wine tumbler glittered on the floor, and the faint smell of gunpowder clung to the air like a ghost. Lyle stood in the centre of the room, the shotgun still in his hand, its weight pulling at his arm. His expression was unreadable, calm, almost detached, but his knuckles were white against the stock of the weapon. Eric sat slumped against the wall, his head in his hands, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. His trembling shoulders betrayed the quiet sobs that broke through the silence. "We have to do it now," Lyle said, his voice steady but devoid of emotion. He set the shotgun down carefully on the floor, the metallic clink as it touched the tile, breaking the stillness. "We call the police. We tell them what we plan to tell them." Eric looked up at his brother, his tear-streaked face pale and hollow. "And they'll believe us?" he asked, his voice cracking. "They'll have to," Lyle replied. "It's all they'll have." The brothers moved mechanically, as if guided by some invisible script. Eric retrieved the other shotgun, wiping the barrel with the sleeve of his sweatshirt. Lyle went to the hallway, turning the lights on and off to simulate a house in disarray. Together, they staged the scene, erasing the deliberate intent behind their actions and replacing it with chaos. The phone call to 911 was quick, frantic, and deliberately vague. Lyle made the call, his voice steady, but with an edge of panic he'd practiced over and over in his head. "Someone shot our parents," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "We just got home and they're dead! Oh my God, please send someone! Eric sat beside him, his face buried in his hands, letting his brother carry the weight of the lie. When the police arrived, the brothers met them at the door. Lyle spoke first, recounting the story they had agreed upon. They had gone out for the evening, they said, to see a movie and grab some food. When they came home, the front door was ajar, the lights were off, and the house felt wrong. Then they found the bodies. The officers moved through the house with a clinical efficiency, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. They photographed the crime scene, measured the angles of the blood spatter, and bagged pieces of shattered glass and shell casings as evidence. The brothers watched from the living room couch, their faces pale and drawn, their silence a reflection of the horror they claimed to have walked into. The hours dragged on as investigators worked. Neighbours gathered on the sidewalk outside the gate, their murmured questions and quiet speculation filling the warm night air. The Menendez mansion, once a symbol of prosperity and ambition, now stood as a silent witness to its own unravelling. As dawn broke over Beverly Hills, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, the house finally fell quiet again. The police had left, the crime scene tape fluttering faintly in the morning breeze. Lyle and Eric were alone once more. In the light of day, the enormity of what they had done began to settle over them. The mansion, with its sprawling halls and glittering chandeliers, felt cavernous and empty. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the open windows seemed to carry the weight of their actions. Eric sat in the family room, staring at the blood-stained carpet. His hands trembled in his lap, his fingers twisting together as if trying to hold on to something solid. "Do you think it'll work?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. Lyle didn't answer right away. He stood by the window, looking out at the manicured lawn and the quiet street beyond. The sun was shining now, bathing the house in a warm golden light, but the warmth didn't reach inside. It didn't touch them. "It has to," Lyle said finally, his voice low but firm. "We don't have a choice." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of what they had done, of what they had tried to erase, hung in the air between them. But as they sat in the silence of their home, now a mausoleum of shattered dreams, there was no relief, no freedom. The walls still held the echoes of the lives they had taken, the lives they had tried to escape. Outside, the world went on. Cars rolled down the street, neighbours sipped their morning coffee, and the sun climbed higher into the sky. But behind the gates of the Menendez mansion, time seemed to stand still, holding its breath as the truth lingered, heavy and unspoken. The Menendez brothers' story didn't end with that night. But in the quiet aftermath, as they sat together in the house they had tried to escape, they were left with a haunting realization. The walls could keep out the world, but they could never keep out the past.